Hello everyone, today's video is going to be looking at American imperialism, so let's launch right into it by making sure we understand what it is as a concept. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. What we're going to do today is we're going to examine reasons why the United States became an imperialist power, and then we're also going to look at how the US and the rest of the world responds to imperialism. So let's start with the reasons. The first primary reason why the United States is setting its sights outward is for the economy. There is an intensified U.S. foreign involvement during this period. On the one hand, U.S. investors want new sources of raw materials for manufacturing. They also want worldwide markets to grow agricultural products. And American conservatives increasingly wanted some sort of safety valve after the Panic of 1893, which seriously jarred the growing American economy after the Civil War. There was also a growing concern for labor management disputes because there was quite a bit of labor unrest during the Gilded Age. So there is a desire, at least in this period of American imperialism, to use economic and diplomatic means to expand foreign influence and not take military action. With that said, though, there is a military and strategic interest in imperialism as well. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, there is an increasing desire to build up the American Navy. There's this general thought that without a strong Navy, there's no real way that the United States can become a world power and secure the foreign markets it's interested in. And the Navy did grow significantly. By 1900, the US had the third largest Navy in the world. Another reason for imperialism was all wrapped around this concept of social Darwinism. I get into that in more detail in another video, so I'll put the link in the description. But just broadly, it was the application of Charles Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest to people, competitions between people. And in an imperialistic sense, it was a competition among nations, races to have military advantages, to have colonies, and to carve out spheres of influence. So the other countries that are really jumping into this competition are Great Britain, France, Russia, and Japan. There are other examples, certainly. I'm going to use those primarily in this video. There is a struggle also for control over weaker countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean, and we'll use several of these as case studies throughout this video. The US is generally, again, afraid that it's going to remain essentially what it sees as a second-class power if it doesn't compete with all these nations that are also rapidly expanding. So the last reason I want to mention here is religious, that we also, and I'll make sure that there's a link to this video below, is a growing emphasis on inserting Christian values into many different American systems. We talked about the gospel of wealth previously, and so we're starting to see many Christian missions sent all over the world in an attempt to convert populations. So here we see a picture of American missionaries visiting China at the turn of the 20th century. So this is just a quick slide to remember that concept of the American frontier. That was a term coined by, well, he didn't coin it. Frederick Jackson Turner, an American journalist who essentially said that the American frontier was closed once the United States solidified its border on the Pacific and once those states achieved statehood. With that said, American imperialists are starting to turn their vision outward, right? They are looking at other places, primarily in the Pacific and also in the Caribbean. So we're going to get into that, starting with Alaska. So Secretary of State William Seward, under both Lincoln and Johnson, helped prevent Great Britain and France from siding with the Confederacy during the Civil War. And the French attempted to occupy Mexico during the Civil War, and Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine and threatened U.S. military action unless the French withdrew. And successfully, William Seward was able to get the French to back down. William Seward was responsible for the purchase of Alaska. So I just wanted to lay that foundation with him invoking the Monroe Doctrine, because you can tell that he's a rather aggressive Secretary of State. So, Alaska was claimed by Great Britain and Russia for decades at this point. Russia eventually assumed control and established a small colony for seal hunting, and it became an economic burden for Russia because of the threat of a British takeover, and Russia was seeking buyers for the territory. And so Secretary of State Seward effectively lobbied for the purchase of Alaska in appreciation for Russian support during the Civil War. And by 1867, Congress agreed to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million. Now, Seward was mocked at the time. Alaska was not really seen for having any valuable resources, and that purchase was nicknamed Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox because Americans, again, just didn't see it valuable. And knowing how many vast resources are in Alaska to this day, we realize how much of a mistake that was by Seward's critics. The cartoon on the left, what you're seeing here is a depiction of Seward as a mother patting the head of their child. And the child is a cartoon representation of a small Andrew Johnson who dresses Uncle Sam. And Seward is depicted soothing President Andrew Johnson with Russian salve, like a pomade, to calm him down from all the problems he was experiencing with Congress. And the map says map of the Russian fairyland, only $7 million in gold. And there are images of the map of Alaska that represent the hostile, snow-covered landscape with seals, polar bears. So again, this is completely taunting Seward. And also the picture on the wall depicts an Aleutian family with the subheading, "One of the Advantage," which was a sarcastic reference to the hostile reception that the indigenous people in Alaska had given to the Russians. This cartoon here on the right is a different take on Seward's Folly, featuring a giant icebox. It says the Russian American, and it was being pushed and pulled by William Seward and President Johnson. And it was supported and moved by this wheelbarrow entitled Treaty, which refers to the treaty with Russia and the bounty, that $7 million that they got that was fading away from the Russian Tsar. So actually, that's another interesting thing to consider, is that if you know European history, you know that the Russian Revolution is rapidly approaching. So one could say that this, even though the Americans are getting mocked for purchasing Alaska at the time, or at least Seward was being mocked, the Russians actually lost a huge asset, and we know that the Russian Empire is on the brink of collapse. Okay, let's look at Hawaii a little bit. So there was an American presence in Hawaii since the early, or rather more like the mid-19th century, and this was a religious presence. American missionaries and also some entrepreneurs settled in the Hawaiian Islands starting in the mid-1800s or so. And Hawaii became a U.S. protectorate in 1849. So that does not mean it was a territory. It was sort of more like it was officially under the influence of the American government. The queen at the time, Liliuokalani, she resisted, of course, this American influence. And because these expansionists really coveted the islands of Hawaii, eventually they do end up deposing the queen. And there's this nationalist movement in support of the queen. They claimed Hawaii for the Hawaiians. And this movement was unsuccessful, partially because Hawaii already was quite diverse at this point. There was a significant population of immigrants. They were Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, Filipino, to name a few, who had come to work on plantations. And so it was rather difficult to secure a nationalist Hawaiian movement when the population already was not totally indigenous people. There were also U.S. business interests in Hawaii. There was already a treaty in place in 1875, the Reciprocity Treaty, that established free trade between the U.S. and Hawaii, and it guaranteed a duty-free market for Hawaiian sugar in exchange for special economic privileges for the U.S. that were denied to other countries. So by 1890, there was a new tariff called the McKinley Tariff, which raised duty on foreign imports to about 50%, and that had a really negative impact on the Hawaiian sugar industry. And so American sugar planters in Hawaii were upset about this. They were upset that their product was being treated as a foreign good because it was American investors who owned these plantations. And eventually, by 1893, this uprising against the Queen, which was supported by many planters, took place. And this 1898 photo here is the celebration of the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. So, of course, a defeat for the Queen and the indigenous population was seen as a victory by American investors and the government. The United States is also interested in accessing Japanese resources at the time. So there already was a presence of American whalers off the coast of Japan. And British and French were increasingly monopolizing coaling stations in Asia. So there was an American Commodore named Matthew Perry who visited Japan. And the second time he visited, he showed up with 10 ships and 1,600 men. And what he wanted was for Japan to open itself up to trade with the United States. Some historians call this a very early example of what's called gunboat diplomacy. I'm going to get into that in a little while here. There was a treaty signed with Japan after this period, and after that, the Japanese isolationist period, at least with the United States, was officially over, and ports were opened for U.S. access. There was also a gentleman's agreement with Japan at the time, and what this did was there were discriminatory laws against Japanese Americans in California at this point, and this was causing friction between the United States and Japan. For example, in San Francisco, there were segregated schools, and that was seen as a national insult on Japan. So President Roosevelt decides with the Japanese emperor to engage in this gentleman's agreement where Japan would restrict allowing worker visas for Japanese workers to go to the United States in exchange for California repealing those discrimination laws. So that's just a very interesting exchange between those two countries, and it shows us that the two are interested in potentially maybe allying with one another at one point. And we'll move forward when we think about World War I pretty soon and consider that significance. In 1907 and 1909, Teddy Roosevelt sent a fleet of battleships called the Great White Fleet on an all-around-the-world cruise, and the purpose of the Great White Fleet was to demonstrate U.S. naval power to Japan and other nations. So that's another great example of gunboat diplomacy. And I said I would explain it later, but I might as well explain it now because I mentioned it twice in this same slide. It's essentially, and again, it kind of goes along with the general philosophy of American imperialism, it's using military strength to try to exercise influence over other countries, but not actually use military force. So it's like flexing your muscles. It's like saying, hey, look at this. I've got all these awesome, cool ships. Now let me trade with you. So it's an intimidation tactic, but not a warlike tactic. Okay, back to it. Where were we? Oh, one last agreement, one last treaty to discuss on this slide. The Root Takahira Agreement in 1908. The Secretary of State Root and the Japanese Ambassador Takahira decide to mutually pledge to respect their Pacific possessions in order to support an agreement with another country, or not an agreement, I should say, a policy with another country called the Open Door Policy in China. And we'll look at that in a minute. I just thought this was a really, really interesting perspective here. So this is a U.S. painting depicting Matthew Perry, the Commodore who opened Japan, so to speak, to the United States. This was a Japanese version of Matthew Perry, and then this was a photograph of him. So I always think it's interesting to visualize these different points of view. Okay, I just mentioned the open door policy to China. Let's go ahead and talk about that. President McKinley's Secretary of State, John Hay, wanted to take advantage of some of the political instability in China at the turn of the 20th century. So China was weakened by political corruption and failure to modernize. And outside countries like Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany had already started to establish spheres of influence there. And a sphere of influence is essentially the idea that these countries could dominate trade and investment in their sphere and shut out competitors. Secretary of State He wanted to prevent the United States from losing access to Chinese trade. And so he issued letters to nations asking for them to open the door, meaning that all these nations would have equal trading privileges in China, and no nation overtly rejected that concept. So He essentially said, well, everybody accepted the open door policy. Now we also have access to trade in China. Again, I was saying before that China is in a very politically unstable place. The last dynasty in Chinese history, the Qing Dynasty, is on the brink of collapse. And because of the open door policy, there will be an adverse reaction to this increased foreign influence in China. And that very much comes to a head with the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So it's a rise of nationalism and xenophobia in China because, again, there are all these foreigners there. And in 1900, this secret society called the Society of Harmonious Fists, aka the Boxers, decided to attack foreign settlements, and they murdered dozens of Christian missionaries. And there was an international force, which included U.S. soldiers, that marched into Peking, which is Beijing today, and it ended up crushing the rebellion. And international forces made China pay a huge sum in indemnities, and that even further weakened China. And so if you took Global Studies 2 last year, if you're one of my students, you might remember that the Qing Dynasty collapses essentially right after this. In 1910, 1911 is when the Republic of China was established, something around there. Sorry, I forget the exact year. That is all taking place right here. So you can tell that American interests in China are very much taking advantage of the timing, what is going on abroad. Here are just some political cartoons depicting the attempt to open the door to China. I recommend that you maybe pause and try to point out some of the details and interpret them on your own. And I say that because I'm looking at what time it is. I was hoping to do all of this in one video, but it's getting a little bit long, so we'll pause. We'll look at the map. We'll think, where have we been? We already looked at Alaska. We already looked at Hawaii. We're going to zoom in and look at some other places in a part 2. So thanks for watching and stay tuned.